I noticed the way he smiled when he asked about the cottage, not at me but past me, like he was already measuring the walls. That smile, I should have trusted what it made me feel. My name is not important. What matters is this. I am 67 years old. I live on a piece of land outside of Collingwood, Ontario, that my late husband and I paid off together over 32 years, and I nearly lost all of it because I was too polite to say what I was thinking out loud. I was raised that way. You don't accuse people of things you can't prove. You give benefit of the doubt. You assume good faith until you can't anymore. That almost cost me everything. My husband passed 6 years ago this past November. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that doesn't give you much warning and doesn't negotiate. He was gone inside of 4 months from diagnosis. I won't pretend those years after were easy, they weren't. But I am not someone who falls apart, and I had my daughter nearby, and I had the property, and I had enough of a pension from my 30 years teaching at the district school board that I wasn't in any kind of desperate position. I want to be clear about that because it matters to this story. I was not a lonely widow looking for company. I was not financially naive. I had an RRSP, a TFSA, and a defined benefit pension. I had a financial advisor I'd worked with for 11 years. The cottage property on Georgian Bay had been appraised twice in recent years and was worth considerably more than when we'd bought it. I knew exactly what I had. I kept organized files. I was not confused about my situation. None of that protected me from what happened. My daughter met him at a work conference in Toronto. She was 34, a project coordinator with a construction management firm, smart and capable in ways that have always made me proud. She had dated before, a few serious relationships, but nothing that had felt right to her over the long term. I had stopped asking. You learn as a mother when to stop asking. She called me from the conference hotel on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear something different in her voice right away. Not giddy, exactly. She was never a giddy person, but lighter, like she'd set something down. His name was Garrett. He was 38. He worked in commercial real estate brokerage out of Barrie. They'd been seated at the same table for a panel discussion and had talked through the entire lunch break, and then for 2 hours in the lobby afterward. She brought him to meet me 6 weeks later. He drove up from Barrie on a Saturday morning. She'd driven separately from the city, and they arrived within 20 minutes of each other. He brought a bottle of Ontario Riesling and a small wheel of local cheese. He shook my hand with both of his and told me he'd heard so much about me. He was handsome in a well-maintained way, good haircut, nice watch that wasn't too flashy. He laughed easily and asked good questions and helped clear the dishes after lunch without being asked. He told me he'd lost his own mother 3 years prior, and that being welcomed into a family home still meant a great deal to him. He was, in short, exactly what someone would design if they wanted to make a favorable impression on a woman like me. The first comment about the property came before we'd finished coffee. We were sitting on the back porch looking out toward the tree line, and he said, "This is a beautiful piece of land. How far does it go back?" And I told him, "The back fence runs about 400 meters from the house, and the side lot lines are staked." He nodded and said something like, "Georgian Bay area properties have really held their value. You must feel good knowing that." I said, yes, I did feel good about that. I didn't think much of it. He worked in real estate. Of course he noticed property. But the next time he came, 3 weeks later, he brought it up again. This time he asked whether there was a right-of-way at the back, whether the well was shared or private, whether the property had ever been severed. These were specific questions, technical questions. I answered them pleasantly, and I noticed my daughter didn't seem to register anything unusual about it. For her, I think, he was just being interested in her mother's life. Being engaged. The third time, he asked whether I'd ever thought about severance, whether splitting off the back lot would be something I'd considered for extra income. I remember the feeling in my chest when he said that, not alarm exactly, more like a small, quiet wrongness. The way you feel when a piece of music goes slightly off-key. You can't always name it immediately, but your body knows. I said I hadn't considered it and wasn't interested in considering it. He smiled and said, of course, he was just curious from a professional standpoint. I did not bring it up with my daughter that weekend, but I started paying closer attention. Over the following months, they were getting serious, talking about moving in together. He'd come up to the property several more times as I catalogued what I noticed. He had asked, at different points, whether I had a mortgage remaining. I didn't. Whether the property was solely in my name or still held jointly with my husband's estate. Solely in my name, transferred after probate, whether my daughter was my only heir, and whether I'd updated my will since my husband passed. Each question came wrapped in something plausible. He was asking about the mortgage in the context of whether property taxes had gone up. He asked about joint ownership because he'd been helping a client through a complicated estate situation. He asked about my will because his own mother's estate had been a mess without one. Plausible. Every single one of them plausible. But there were too many of them. And they all circled the same things: the property, what it was worth, who it belonged to, and who it would go to. I made an appointment with my financial advisor without telling my daughter why. I sat across from her in her office on Dunlop Street and told her what I'd observed. She listened carefully. She didn't dismiss me. She said, "You're right to pay attention. So let's make sure everything is structured properly." We reviewed my will. We reviewed the beneficiary designations on my registered accounts. We talked about the cottage property and whether there were any additional protective measures worth considering. She suggested I consult an estate lawyer, which I did 2 weeks later. The lawyer was a woman about 10 years younger than me who had been practicing estates and wills in Simcoe County for decades. She listened to my situation with the same calm attention. She said what I was describing, a romantic partner who takes unusual interest in an aging parent's assets, was something she saw more often than people would expect. She called it predatory relationship targeting. She said it didn't always come from a place of pure calculation. Sometimes people convinced themselves they were in love while also being motivated by financial gain. But she said the pattern was recognizable. She helped me set up a property protection trust, updated my will with very specific language, and drafted a document that would give my daughter access to my affairs in the event of my incapacity, but explicitly excluded any partner of hers from involvement in that capacity, unless specifically added later by me, in writing with a witness. I felt better having done that, more solid, and I want to be honest, I still wasn't certain. I had no proof. He had never done anything overtly wrong. He was kind to my daughter from everything I could see. She seemed genuinely happy. I had no way of knowing whether he was a calculating predator or simply a man who thought about real estate, the way some people think about the weather, constantly, and without meaning anything by it. I kept watching, and I kept my mouth shut. About 8 months after I'd first met him, my daughter called me on a Thursday evening and told me he'd proposed. She was crying a little, the good kind of crying, and she said yes, she'd said yes, and the ring had been his grandmother's, and she wanted me to see it in person as soon as possible. I told her I was so happy for her. I told her I loved her. I said all the right things because I meant them. I wanted her to be happy, genuinely. But I also hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long time in the dark, because something had shifted in me. Now the timeline had a shape. Now there was an endpoint toward which all those questions had been moving. I called my estate lawyer the next morning. We talked through what engagement and then marriage would mean from a legal standpoint. In Ontario, when you marry, the Family Law Act entitles your spouse to equalization of net family property if the marriage breaks down. It's complicated, and there are exclusions. Property you brought into the marriage is often excluded from the calculation, as is inherited property, if you handle it correctly. But the matrimonial home designation was something I needed to understand carefully. If my daughter and her husband ever lived in my cottage property, and if it were ever designated as a matrimonial home, his rights to it could change significantly. My lawyer was very clear. I needed to make absolutely certain the property arrangements were structured to protect both me and my daughter in all scenarios. I also, somewhere in there, started doing something I'm not entirely proud of but don't regret. I started asking around. Garrett had told us he worked for a commercial brokerage in Barrie, handling lease negotiations and property acquisitions. My daughter had been to his office. I had no reason to doubt that. But I asked a woman I knew from my teaching years. Her husband had worked in commercial real estate in Barrie for 20 years. Whether she'd ever heard the name, she hadn't. But her husband had. And what he told her and what she told me made me sit down. Garrett had worked for that brokerage. past tense. He'd left or been let go, depending on who you talked to, about 2 years prior. There had been something about a property transaction that hadn't gone the way it was supposed to. Nothing that resulted in charges. But his name was not one people in that community said warmly. I sat with that for a week. I didn't know what to do with it. It was secondhand. It was vague. My daughter was in love. The wedding was being planned for the following June, here on the property. She'd always wanted to get married here, and I'd always imagined that too. I told myself to wait, to watch, to not blow up my daughter's happiness based on gossip and a feeling. But then I found the email. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I know how it sounds. I was not snooping. I was not going through my daughter's things. She had been staying with me for a week in the spring, helping me clean out the garage and some of the back rooms, and she'd used my laptop to print something off. When she handed the laptop back to me, she hadn't logged out of her email. I saw the name Garrett in the subject line of a thread that was visible on the screen. I should have closed it. I know that. I didn't. The email thread was between Garrett and someone I didn't recognize, a name I'd never heard in connection with my daughter or her life. It was 3 messages, short. The most recent one, from Garrett, said something I will not forget. He said the timeline was tighter than expected. He said the wedding needed to stay on schedule. He said the property situation would be clearer once things were formalized, and that he just needed a bit more time to sort out the financing side. The property situation. That phrase, those 3 words, I closed the laptop. I walked outside and stood by the fence at the back of the yard and looked out at the tree line for a long time. The maples were coming in. The light was the kind of late afternoon Ontario light that makes everything look like it's been gilded from the inside. I thought about the 32 years my husband and I had spent on this land. I thought about the summers my daughter had grown up here. I thought about what I owed her, not protection from life, not protection from her own choices, but honesty, and something else. I went back inside. I called my estate lawyer. I told her what I'd seen, and then together we made a plan. I said nothing to my daughter, not yet. This was the hardest part, watching her in those weeks leading up to the wedding, watching how happy she seemed, watching her choose table linens, and talk about the caterer and stand in the backyard, imagining where the chairs would go. I wanted so badly to be wrong about him. But I had also watched her trust someone with everything, and I could not let that trust be the instrument of her own undoing. My lawyer had connected me with a private investigator based in Barrie, retired RCMP, professional, discreet. He found things that mattered. Garrett had a business loan from 2 years prior that had gone into default. He had a previous relationship with a woman in Innisfil that had ended under acrimonious circumstances, involving a disputed investment she'd made in a property deal he'd arranged. The woman had not pursued legal action, but she had consulted a lawyer. The paper trail existed. More relevantly, Garrett had several months ago spoken to a mortgage broker. He had listed as a potential future asset a property in Collingwood that he described as his fiancé's family estate. He had not spoken to me about this. He had not spoken to my daughter about this. He had done it quietly and apparently confidently, as though it were simply a matter of waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The week before the wedding, I told my daughter. I want to say I handled it perfectly, and I didn't. I sat across from her at the kitchen table where I've sat with her through every hard thing in her life, and I put what I'd found in front of her, the investigator's summary, the email I'd seen, the details about the mortgage broker, and I watched her face go through every stage of something breaking. She didn't believe me at first. Then she was angry at me. Then she was quiet in the way that means something has landed somewhere deep and you need time. She left that afternoon. She didn't come back for 2 days. When she came back, she had been to see Garrett. She had asked him about the mortgage broker. She had asked him about the email. She hadn't told him what she knew or how she knew it. She'd just asked. And he had stumbled. He'd had a reason for everything, but the reasons didn't quite connect. He'd gotten defensive in a way she said she'd never seen before. She told me later. It was the first time I felt like I was talking to someone I didn't know. She didn't call off the wedding that day. I want to be honest about that. The invitations had gone out. People were traveling. Her dress was hanging in the spare room. She was not ready to be certain yet. But she came to me 2 nights before the wedding, and she hugged me for a long time without saying anything. And when she pulled back, she looked at me and said, "I'm going to need you close to me that day. Okay? Just stay close," I said I would. I didn't know yet what she was planning. I don't think she entirely knew either. The wedding day was one of those June mornings in Ontario that make you understand why people talk about the province the way they do. Cool in the early hours, then warm, a sky that was almost absurdly blue over the tree line. The chairs were set up in the backyard. Friends and family filled them. My daughter walked toward the front of the arrangement, looking like something out of a photograph I'd been keeping in my heart for years. She was carrying white and pale yellow flowers. A simple, loose arrangement, the kind she'd always preferred, the officiant began. I watched her face throughout. She was calm in a way that was different from happy. Steady. The way you are when you've made a decision you've thought all the way through to the end. About 3 minutes in, before the vows, she turned slightly and reached into her bouquet. I thought she was adjusting a stem, but then her hand came toward me, and folded inside her palm was a piece of paper, small, the kind torn from a notebook. She pressed it into my hand without breaking her gaze from the front. I opened it in my lap. 4 words, "Mom, please, stand up." I looked at her. She was still facing forward. She gave the smallest nod, barely a movement at all. I stood up. I did not make a speech. I did not accuse him of anything in front of the guests. What I did was address the officiant calmly and say that I needed to raise something before the ceremony proceeded, and that I had documentation that I believed the couple's guests and the couple themselves needed to be aware of before any legal commitments were made. What happened in the next 30 minutes was complicated and not particularly dignified, and I will not pretend otherwise. Garrett's composure left him faster than I would have expected. He said things that revealed, to everyone standing there on my back lawn in the June sunshine, that the questions he'd been asking for 2 years had not been idle curiosity. My daughter stood very still through all of it. She asked him one question, and only one. "Did you talk to a mortgage broker about my mother's property?" He said it was complicated. She said, "That's a yes." She handed the officiant her flowers. She asked the guests to help themselves to the food, which had already been laid out, and to please drive home safely. Then she came and stood beside me. We stood there together for a while after most people had left, looking out at the tree line, the same tree line I had been looking at since the year before my daughter was born. She didn't say anything for a long time, neither did I. There was nothing that needed to be said immediately, and we both knew that. Finally, she said, "I should have listened to the feeling I had." There was a feeling. I told her I'd had the same one. She said, "Why didn't you say something earlier?" I said I had no proof earlier. I said I hadn't wanted to be wrong. I said I'd been afraid of losing her if I was wrong. She took my hand. That was 8 months ago. My daughter is doing well, genuinely well, not just performing it. She's been therapy, which she says has been good, and she's let herself grieve the relationship without letting it define what comes next. She's back to herself in ways that are subtle and important. I had the estate documents reviewed again after everything's settled. My lawyer said everything was in order. The property is protected. My daughter understands now, in a way she didn't before, what her father and I built here and what it means to protect it. There is a moment I keep coming back to. Not the wedding, not the confrontation, not any of the dramatic pieces. It's a moment from last October, about 2 months after everything happened, when my daughter drove up for a weekend and we raked leaves together in the backyard, not talking much, just working side by side in the way you can when you know someone well enough that silence isn't absence. At one point she stopped and looked at the back tree line and said, "I forgot how much I love it here." I said I did too sometimes, that you could forget the thing that was right in front of you. She laughed, a real laugh, the kind I hadn't heard in a while. We raked until the light went. Some things are worth protecting. Not because of what they're worth on paper, but because of everything they carry that no appraisal can touch. My husband is in this land. My daughter's childhood is in this land. The life we chose is in this land. No one gets to walk in here with a smile and take that apart. Not on my watch, not ever.